Well, the result of putting it on the motor analyzer wasn't great. It's not much I can do. That's the motor I've got. So I'm going to run it like that. So now the body's been painted, it's time to have a look at getting the motor back in the chassis. So I just thought that before I actually put the motor back into the chassis, I would have a look and see what's the RPM on the motor. It's supposed to be 21,000 RPM at 12 volts. So let's see. So I'm going to use my little motor analyzer here. This is version 1 of the motor analyzers. There will be a new version coming out next year. So I've ceased production of the version 1 because I've got some brilliant ideas of what I'm going to include in the version 2. So I am actually taking some interest and pre-orders for the version 2 at the moment. But thought I'd just use this as a quick way to work out what the RPM of the motor is. So let's slide it into my motor analyzer. Let's just connect that up. Oh, turn the power on. So in order to do RPM, I'm just going to look at the warm-up test. I'm not going to do acceleration and braking. I've only got one motor, so at the moment it doesn't really matter what it goes like. It's just out of interest. So let's run the warm-up. We're on 5 volts at the moment. So that's rotating. You don't need a pinion on the motor. The motor analyzer picks up the RPM off of the rotation of the armature and the magnetic field. It doesn't use the pinion. So at 5 volts, we've got 4,800. So I'm going to turn the voltage up and see what do we get by the time we get to 12 volts. So at 12 volts, we're getting 22.6, 22.7. It's fairly consistent. It's not jumping about all over the place. Maybe that's quite a smooth motor. It's fairly close to 21. So hopefully that'll be a good motor. Well, let's see when we get it out on the track. I've got my parts ready now for putting my motor back into the car. So I've got my little motor bracket, motor block here. Remember, when you put it in, to get it the right way round, obviously, because it's got some recess for these motor screws. So the very small motor screws are the ones that are going to go underneath from the chassis. The slightly larger ones are the ones that go into the can of the motor. And if you remember, I couldn't remember where these two washers appeared from in my last video. But then I went back and I rewound the video and did a little slow-mo, and I found that these were two washers actually came from these small screws that go underneath the chassis here. So I'll be putting those back on in the right place. So let's get assembling this motor and put it back in the chassis. Now, when I took it apart, I couldn't get, if I put when the bracket was like that, I couldn't get the motor out of the chassis. So I had to undo the bracket to get the whole motor out. So in order to put it back in again, I'm going to fix the bracket to the motor first, and then I can drop the whole thing into the chassis and screw it from underneath. So the bracket's now loosely fixed to the motor. You can see it's just wobbling around there. I haven't tightened those screws up yet. Now, the eagle eye of you might have seen in a previous shot or a previous video that when I was showing you the chassis, I'd actually put the gear on the wrong way round. It wasn't important at that stage because it was just to lift the chassis up and check the chassis was flat and straight, etc. But nobody's commented on that. A bit surprised you didn't notice that. But yeah, the gear I'd pushed on the wrong way round. Anyway, the gear goes on that way round. But I'm going to remove it for now because I need to screw the motor in and that will get in the way. Now, before I screwed the motor in as well, I've also made sure that there aren't any burrs around these sliding slots there. And again, I've just checked around the inside, make sure there aren't any burrs around the inside, because that's going to cause the block to sit at a funny angle. And the motor's not going to sit nice and straight and line up with the gears. Let's get this motor in. So I've assembled the little motor screw with the washer on the back on my end of my Allen key. I can drop the motor in, turn it over, and screw in the bracket. That's one side. That's the other side. And then I'll leave it loose. Well, I'll loosen it up and then I can slide it and I can get a decent gear mesh. Right, you may have also noticed I've installed the motor with the black wire furthest back. Now at Pendle Slot Racing, they race with positive on the right. So that's the red wire on the right. Now they do allow a free choice of wires, but this wiring's pretty good. It's nicely silicone coated, it's nice and flexible. It's 22 gauge wire, which is thick enough for the power of this motor, which doesn't draw very many amps at all. And the black wire is longer than the red wire. So ideally, probably I would have installed it the other way so that the red wire was on the right in effect already and I didn't need to cross over the wires. But as the black wire is longer than the red wire, they're plenty long enough. And I don't need to really change the wires. They're insulated nicely on the back of the motor here. So we'll give them a go. It might be something I do in the future is put new lead wire on it. But at the moment, I think I'm fairly happy that that lead wire is going to be good. So I'm going to tighten up the motor screws in the bracket so that the motor is held on to the bracket. Just going to nip them up. Not too tight at this stage, just nip them up just to hold it in place. And then I'm going to slide the gear on and try and get the motor position correct to get a good alignment of my gear mesh. So that is that. I don't know whether you can see in the video, but that motor does slide backwards and forwards like that. It does stick through the hole on the chassis a little bit. You know, it's actually lower than the center section of the chassis, so there's no way you could run zero ground clearance on the chassis because your motor would be hanging through the chassis. I do believe that there is magnetic braid on the Pendle track, but I don't suppose these magnets in this motor are going to be anywhere near strong enough to actually provide any magnet traction. Plus the fact that the ground clearance is still absolutely massive, even on very small rear tyres. That's probably something, I don't know why RevoSlot have done that, but their wheels and their hubs are actually probably too big for the car. It'd be nice to run it on much smaller hubs. So you could bring the tyres down, you could bring the clearance down, you could lower your whole chassis. But that's what we've got to work with, so that's what we're going with. So what I'm looking for with my gear mesh is a very small amount of play or backlash between the two gears. So that's just moving a fraction. Now there are some different techniques of setting up the gear mesh. Some people use a little piece of paper in between of various thicknesses. That's quite a common technique, to actually put a bit of paper between the gears, push the motor into the gear more or less as tight as you can, and then slowly feed the paper out. This is a plastic gear. It may damage that if you're not, too careful with the paper. Even the paper could damage or dent a tooth on a plastic gear. But people do it. People get away with it. I just tend to do it by sort of eye and just allow a little bit of backlash. And then I'm going to pinch them up and then see how it runs, and if I need to move the motor one way or the other to get a smoother gear mesh. Right, so I've put my motor now in the chassis. I've made sure that everything's fairly tight. Not totally tight yet. I've not finished pinching it up totally, but it's enough to stop it from moving around and rattling about. I've got my gear mesh set up, so there is a very small amount of backlash. I'll show you a bit closer to the camera. So you can see there's a very small amount of backlash in those gears or movement. It's not perfect because there's more backlash one side of the pinion to the other. See, it's quite tight there, but then it's quite loose there. So it's probably the spur rather than the pinion actually. The angled spur. You can see there's slightly more backlash one side than the other. So put that together, it's probably where it's tightened up on the grub screw. Let's see, so if I move the grub screw close to the pinion, then I would expect there to be less backlash at this point. Is this right? Well, no. Turn it round through about 180 degrees. Well, actually, it's the opposite way round. So normally you'd expect the little grub screw to be pulling the gear slightly further away from the pinion, but actually it's bringing it closer together, so that's probably right. If I ended up putting the grub screw in the other side, then my gear mesh would probably be worse. So you can see I've just dropped a little bit of oil in between the gear and the pillar block, and I've just oiled the bearings at the back, and I put a little blob of oil again on the bushing of the motor. So it's time to fire it up and see what happens. So I've just got my chassis resting on a little bit of plastic here, just to lift the gear off the block. So let's connect that up there and connect the positive up. Now I've connected on a very low speed at the moment. It's on 2.8 volts. Now that's turning over and it's going backwards. Well, stupid me. I would have assumed that the red was the positive and the black was the negative, and that the car would go forwards. Well, that doesn't seem to be the case. When you wire it up that way, it actually rotates backwards. So I'm going to have to swap the wires around and connect it up the other way to get the car to move forwards. Well, I don't know whether you can hear that in the video, but it seems to be going much slower now. It's going forward, but the motor's rotating slower. So clearly the motor doesn't run as fast one way as it does the other way, so it must have some timing on it perhaps, or depending on how the brushes have run in. I'll put it back on my motor analyzer and see what the result is.
A few moments later.
Well, the result of putting it on the motor analyzer wasn't great. It's rotating at 19,000 RPM, so that's a little bit down on what it says it's supposed to do. Maybe it will run in. I plan to do a fair bit of practice with the car because I don't know the track. So hopefully it will run in nicely and get quicker as we go. There's not much I can do. That's the motor I've got. So I'm going to run it like that. Right, so I just couldn't live with myself with the wires being the wrong way round, as in black being positive and red being negative. So I've just swapped them around on the motor, and then it also gave me an opportunity to route the wires a little bit better at the back of the motor. So although there is a red dot there and there's a black wire, at least they're right when it comes to the front, and I know which wire is actually which to make the car go forward. As I say, gear mesh is quite smooth, so I'm fairly happy with that. Let's say we'll see what it sounds like when the back wheels are on and everything running around. But it's time to put the lead wires in. So you can see that I've done one already. I've done the negative wire. So I've looped it underneath, then spun it round and put it into the guide at the front. Now the car comes with these little eyelets. So they're sort of hollow tubes with a little collar on them. And then you push the wire into them, fold them over, and then you push them in there like a friction fit in these holes on the guide. Now I've seen other people use things like little grub screws to hold them in. Quite a nice idea, I quite like that, but sometimes I suppose that could damage the wire, cause fracture points in the wire. I mean, I've seen people even sort of solder them to the braids. I've seen little screws, as I say, that hold it in not only from the top, but I've also seen screws that hold the wire in or the braids in from the front. Again, all those sort of things could end up damaging the braid or the wire itself and causing a fracture point. But I don't know whether I'm actually allowed to do any of that for the rules or any other methods other than what came with the car. So I'm going to use these little eyelets and push them in. They are a pretty tight fit. I did have to push them in using a bit of force with a pair of pliers to get it in for the first time, but they are a good fit in there. So let's get this other one fitted. So as you can see, they really are quite a bit fiddly, but it's in. The guide is moving and it's self-centering. I'll just bend those lead wires a little bit just to get it to sit a little bit better. There we go. That's sitting quite nicely. There's not too much flex on these wires at the front there to cause them to break. The guide doesn't actually turn that far, and that is something that other people have commented about, how you can be actually on the guide stop, and that might be one of the things that causes the blade to break off the bottom. So yes, the guide turn is not that far. So we'll see how that goes. But there we are, lead wires fitted. Now time to put the back wheels on. Let's just see how wide the back end is. I've assembled it with the standard width rear wheels, with the standard spacers that are there. So it appears to be just under 63 millimeters. It's just catching on the edge of the tires. So 63 millimeters wide with all the standard rear wheels on. Now, that used to be the rules at Pendle Slot, but when they've allowed the wider wheels, they've increased the width to 64. So let's see how I'm going to get it to 64. Now, let's take these off. So I'll probably have to remove that little spacer there, and that big spacer. So let's put one of the wide wheels directly on. Now, to space that out, I do happen to have a spare front wheel spacer, or front axle spacer. So let's put that on along with that. So that basically totals something that's shorter. Don't know whether you can see. If I hold it with a pair of tweezers, you might be able to see. So that is actually shorter by about just over the width of that little spacer there than the standard spacer that was with it. So when I put on the other wide wheel, let's see what we get now. So let's open that up and we come down. Yeah, so we're just, with that set of spacers, see, we're just under 64 millimeters wide with the wide tyres. Now I think most Revo slots now do come with the wide tyres. I don't know whether they've stopped doing the narrow ones or whether it's just a change on newer models, but apparently they just supply the wide tyres now, so hence why the rules have been changed to allow those wide tyres. But for my bit of practice initially, I don't know how long tyres are going to last or how much grip there's going to be, so I'm going to assemble it with the narrow ones to start with, see how the car runs, and then potentially change to the wider ones when I get there. When you're setting up your back axle, one thing to watch is that you try and get your axle to be totally central to the car and come through the hubs as far as it can on both sides. So you can see here, it's just a fraction short of the end of the hub. And again, it's the same the other side. So what you need to do is you need to loosen the grub screw in your gear, and then you can push the axle from one side or the other until you've spaced it evenly across your car. And that way you know you've got as much axle as possible sitting inside your hubs, and your hubs can then be as stable as possible on your axle.